Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on local authorities and how food growing and COVID-19 have opened up opportunities for health, community building, skills, and I would add community resilience and economy as well, building a strong, resilient local economy. Um, so the agenda is up on the screen. We are going to have a couple polls in between our sort of question and answers sessions. And we are going to start with a poll before we get into the discussions and presentations today.
Brilliant. I think almost everyone has taken part, so I'm just going to end that poll. Thanks, Dee.
Okay. And that's interesting to see that majority of people here are working with a council and not involved in capital growth or the Good to Grow network, which is part of the Sustainable Food Places. So hopefully this webinar will sort of resolve some of your queries. We're going to dispel some myths as well about working with local authorities, and hopefully leave here today with plans. So let's just get into it. And we'll start with good practice in London. And we have Sarah Williams, who's the program director of Sustain. And Sarah joined Sustain in 2009 as part of the capital growth team, who successfully supported 2012 new community food growing spaces in London. Sarah has developed new areas of work at Sustain, including the National Big Dig program and work on our Growing Health project. She currently oversees most of the London program of work run under the London Food Link umbrella and represents Sustain on the London Food Board.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Hope everyone's doing well. Can people hear me? Maybe do a thumbs up. And also great to hear in the chat who people are, where they're from, what they're doing. Otherwise, sometimes we feel like we're broadcasting to an empty room. As you know, I'm sure many of you have already been doing lots of these Zoom webinars, but Sustain like to encourage a really chatty chat box. So just say whatever, say what you've had for lunch or what seedlings you're planting at the moment or anything of that ilk. So yeah, do feel free to chat. And thank you so much, Dee, for hosting us today. Really great to have you here. Dee is a massive advocate and campaigner for all things food, including food growing. So really good to have you holding the space for us. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now. Let's see how this goes. Okay, and I'm going to try to do slideshow from beginning. Okay. So as Dee alluded to, I've been working in this area for quite a while now. So looking at how we support and enable more people to grow food, more people to access land for food growing. And I have to say, when I started at Sustain all those many years ago, things were a lot more difficult, particularly in London, which is where my most experience has been had. So if you went to your housing manager on your council estate and said, I want to grow food, they sort of went a little bit shaky and started throwing lots lots of health and safety information at you, and that still exists to a certain extent, but I think food growing has to a certain extent been normalized in public spaces, and it's really good to see that progress that's been made over the last decade or so, and thanks to probably many of you that are sharing this space with us today, and many of the local authorities and activists out there. I think what's really interesting as well is that during 2020, demand for food growing spaces dramatically surged as people were locked down, food supply looked a little bit insecure, and suddenly people wanted to be able to have that personal and community resilience where they could grow the freshest, healthiest food for themselves and others, and not be reliant on the undignified, in some circumstances, situation where people are having to rely on handouts, unnecessary as we know it is. So yeah, we've had a sort of real surge in interest from us, and to meet this sort of immediate as well as this longer term need, we think that there really is a big role for councils, and we think that that exists across three main areas, which I'll cover today. So it's partly about capacity building and practical support, about access to land and land use and supportive policies and planning policies around that, as well as other partnerships and support for growing within plans and strategies. So why should councils support food growing? I mean, hopefully this is the rudimentary 1, 2, 3, and we all know this. If you want any more evidence of this, we've made a lot of documents available that show evidence on how good food growing is across a number of issues. So this is partly about access for residents to healthy food. And that might be a small contribution to their diets, but often it can be a really important supplement to people's diets. But more than that, it's about creating healthy and active neighbourhoods, about building resilience and mentally healthy communities. And I think that's one thing in particular that food growers really relished over the last year, is just being outside in the fresh air and feeling better. We've got lots of evidence of people feeling safer and feeling more connected to their communities as a result of community gardens. Naturally, it makes for greener, more environmentally sustainable communities, and we're going to be doing some quite significant work over the next 3 years in London in looking at how we measure some of that climate resilience and nature resilience that green community food growing spaces provide in urban areas. And increasingly, we're looking at productive growing, and one of the initiatives that we were leading over the last year, my colleagues Fee and Ren were involved in, was the community harvest, which showed how not only urban farms but also community growers wanted to increase their productivity to respond to the need that was out in their communities. We're also seeing some really interesting areas around Green New Deal. It's going to be a big priority for London. So how do we make sure that food growing is seen as an opportunity to build skills and to create green jobs? So it's not just small scale. In London, also about 59% of the green belt is agricultural land, about 20,000 hectares. And we know that a lot of that is within council ownership or influence. And there's a lot more opportunity for local markets to be built around locally produced food, and for this to also add to community wealth building. So really tons of opportunities, and I could do a whole presentation on that, but I won't. So as I mentioned, what we really want to do is see where we can specifically support councils in actions that they can take. There are a number of areas that we measure each year through our Good Food for London report, which last year was combined with our Beyond the Food Bank report to something called Response, Resilience and Recovery. But every year we've been measuring what local authorities can do around food growing. So we know all of these things are possible. And obviously there are budgets and other resource constraints, but if there is political commitment, then these things can happen. So again, around these three key areas. And I've just highlighted here a few of the publications that we have produced. So Capital Growth and Sustain are coming from a place of experience on this stuff, I suppose. We have been working with councils. This isn't something that we've dreamt up in an office in the middle of Bethnal Green. This is stuff that we know from our work over the last 12 years. So we have documents like the Edible Estates document, which is targeted at housing associations, but obviously relevant for councils too, about looking at the different ways you can establish food growing on council and housing association owned land. Food growing in parks, again looking to parks and the ownership of parks that local authorities have and how they can integrate food growing there. We also have documents on planning, and as I mentioned, the response, resilience and recovery, otherwise known as Good Food for London and Beyond the Food Bank, also details how local authorities can take action. So we've broken the measures that we use in these reports into some steps for action. And just to say that we also today are publishing, we've just published a draft briefing that covers all of this information. So we'll put the link to the chat in the chat to that, and do check this out. So the first area is a cross-cutting approach. How do we ensure that councils include food growing into a food strategy or other relevant strategies and plans? So this covers public health and the increasingly important area of social prescribing. We know that food growing can deliver on that. Parks and green spaces strategies. How do your food growing spaces give people access, the important access that they need to open spaces and nature spaces? And we know that there are some particular areas and particular communities where there is a deficit in green spaces. So what role can community food growing play in stepping into that deficit in access to open space? Climate and nature emergency action plans. We know that lots of local authorities have climate action plans in place, but we know that food doesn't always feature in them, and we know that food growing probably doesn't feature in as many as it could in terms of providing climate resilience, as well as sort of important issues around awareness of climate. Green New Deal, as I mentioned, it's going to be on the cards a lot for a lot of local authorities, and there is evidence around how community food growing builds skills. Community wealth building. What about food growing strategies? We know that our neighbours up in Scotland now have a requirement to produce a food growing strategy. How might having food growing strategies within our other UK nations progress this agenda and create a bit more of a joined up approach? Then under the heading of capacity building and support, what support, lead or partnerships do you have that are actually developing orchards, community gardens or school food growing spaces on the ground? What ongoing support do you provide to food growing projects? And what small grants or other resources have you got? This could be information packs or signposting to the wealth of information that's out there. One of the really key things that we've found over the years is just having a named officer that can help navigate sometimes complex internal systems at the local authority level is really, really important. Or having a lead, if you're lucky enough to have a voluntary or community sector organisation that covers the borough and can play a sort of lead partnership role, then it's really down to the local authority to start building capacity in that area. Quite a lot on here on land use. I won't go bullet by bullet because I might be running over. But how can you, as a local authority, encourage use of publicly owned land? So this isn't just about allowing people to ask for permission, but this is actively seeking communities to take ownership of publicly owned land, which is often left neglected, the little bits of land in between houses, or sometimes is sat on for development in future years. But what about the communities that could use that in the meanwhile? Really important to have a clear route for people to, when they do want to use some land, how do they go about finding who owns it and getting permission? I've already mentioned about parks and the really important role that parks can play. But really, often for a lot of local authorities, about taking one step back and looking at how they map and track the amount of land available to grow food and to set some targets to increase that. And I think we might hear from Malvern Forest a bit later, who I believe have done exactly that. And finally, just to not forget planning. Planning policies are really important. So it's great to review those policies, and we've got some really good guidance on that. That's about having supportive planning policies and ways to get developers to look at making community gardens a part of new developments. Final thing, support on offer. If you're not already aware of us, then please do check out in London our Capital Growth Network, and increasingly we're offering support to local authorities that are trying to do more in this area. And also our Good to Grow via Sustainable Food Places is a national network of networks, I like to call it. And actually I didn't check that URL, so Ren, you might want to correct me if that's wrong. But do come and talk to us if this is something you are looking to do more of in your local authority. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And that's a lot to take in, but the takeaway from that is cross-cutting or integrated action and planning, and to look at support land use policy and see where those levers are.
Totally. And just to say, we have got this checklist for action that we've uploaded. So what local authorities can do is use that, or partnerships can use that to review their practice and see their areas for development. I'll shut up now.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Just a bit of housekeeping. We are going to have Q&A, and there's a Q&A box that should be at the bottom of your screen. If you type in your questions there, then they will be passed on to me. But keep chatting in the chat function as well. And yes, we will be sharing the recording and slides of the event. So next up, we have Fee McAllister, also from Sustain, who will give us some more case studies. And Fee has coordinated the Capital Growth Network since May 2020, and used to coordinate the Growing Communities Veg Box Scheme and Learning Program. Fee has a background in community engagement and setting up school and estate food growing projects in East London. Floor is all yours, Fee.
Thanks, Dee. Lovely to see so many people today. Yes, as Dee said, I'm Fee and I coordinate Capital Growth. Just planning to spend a couple of minutes today following up on some of what Sarah has said, and so specifically about the work in London. And so I hope to bring to life some of that good work, which I think is both encouraging and inspiring and definitely applicable to other areas too. So we're actually going to get a chance to hear from a couple of councils and initiatives themselves in a moment, which is why I'll try and keep my bit short, as it's much more interesting to hear straight from the councils and the food growing initiatives. But I want to give a little flavour of what we've learnt that is going well across London and why we think it's going well. So Sarah's already referred to the report, and there is a link in the chat. If you do get a chance to download it, the part on food growing and production is on page 24. I'm just having a problem. Oh, there we go. I couldn't move my slides. But so, yeah, what did we learn about what councils have been up to for the last year in London? Well, the majority of councils have been supporting initiatives including orchards, community gardens or school gardens, which is great. Of the 26 councils responding to the questions on this area, 16 encouraged and enabled use of publicly owned land, and that included parkland, housing estates for community food growing, and 9 councils told us that they proactively increased the amount of land for food growing over the last year. And councils who showed leadership before lockdown were also able to take positive steps and show further leadership during their emergency response, particularly those working with external partner organisations, and we'll hear about some of that later through the agenda. And finally, although many food growing spaces were forced to close or adapt during the pandemic, 15 councils told us that they supported community gardens to continue to grow, and 11 went further to connect growers with local food providers, including food banks. In the report, we highlighted 5 councils showing leadership, and these were Greenwich, Islington, Southwark, Tower Hamlets and Waltham Forest. So let's dig a little bit deeper and eke out what's working well for those folks and how they're supporting food growing initiatives. I'm going to let Greenwich and Waltham Forest speak for themselves in a moment, but I'll just touch on the other 3. And if I can just start with Southwark, of the councils surveyed in the report, 18 refer to funding available to food growing projects, with many also leading on the creation of new sites, so orchards. And Southwark Council's a really good example of this, with a long history of practical support to its food growing groups, having worked with Garden Organic to create a network of master gardeners, and funding lots of sites through the Cleaner, Greener, Safer programme. And the council's now excitingly gone one step further as part of a council commitment to launch an allotment expansion guarantee programme with the appointment of 2 community gardening coordinators. So Sophie and Ruth are supporting residents to set up new food growing and community gardening spaces alongside supporting existing community gardening gardeners and gardens. So really good work going on in Southwark. And if I just touch on Tower Hamlets for a moment as well. So the survey showed us that the right foundations enabled quick and appropriate responses through COVID. Tower Hamlets, really good example, proactively supported its residents to continue to grow throughout the pandemic, signposting to guidelines and resources to operate safely. And through their long-standing partnership with Women's Environment Network, WEN, they also supported a Keep Growing campaign involving the Tower Hamlets Food Partnership and distributing growing packs to local residents, as well as training videos and online events. And one last example in Islington, another strong partnership, another example of strong partnership working. They've commissioned a community partner, Octopus Community Network, to help develop a community food growing strategy which will map all existing food growing opportunities in the borough, but also identify new spaces too. And it's worth mentioning that food growing is embedded in both Islington Council's food strategy action plan as well as its food poverty action plan. So hopefully these examples are kind of helpful in telling a story about London and some of the really good work that's happening across the councils. And I will stop there, but I will put some of these links in the chat in a moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fee. So I don't know if anyone wanted to come in. We do have sort of Waltham Forest coming up right now to talk about how they've been working together with Rashika Ahmad from Hedge Herbs as one community example. So we have Mariella Diaz, who's the allotments officer, and they have 27 allotment sites in the local authority, and they are currently busy finalizing their food growing strategy and building a food partnership with different stakeholders. And Rashika is a community medical herbalist practicing in North London and part of the community apothecary, herb growing, skill sharing and land care project in collaboration with Organically in Waltham Forest.
Shall I start? Thank you, Dee. Thanks a lot, and thanks to Fee and Sarah at Sustain, all of you for inviting us. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project that we're doing. As Dee, you said, it's in collaboration with Organically, but supported by Waltham Forest Council. So Mariella there, who's the allotments officer for the council. But yeah, I'm part of this project, the Community Apothecary, which has been brewing for a little while, but basically in a nutshell is the idea of bringing people together to learn about plant medicine, to learn about growing herbs for food and for medicine, also bringing in care of the land and the ecosystems where we're growing them. So my interest is as a medical herbalist in growing the herbs, but also to support people to learn about how to practice herbalism together. But the project really has come about through the last few years of working in partnership with Organically, the food growing co-op in Waltham Forest, and discussions around could we grow our herbs for medicine alongside food, and the idea of a patchwork of herb gardens that people in the localities around them could get involved with. So there are 3 of us in the Community Apothecary, which is a CIC. We recently constituted as a community interest company, and it's myself as the herbalist, but then along with Izzy and Jimena, who are 2 horticultural growers who are particularly interested in herbs. And so part of the connection with Organically is through Mulberry Close, which is what we're talking about today. I'm just going to share my screen for a second. And this is an allotment site that has So as Sarah was talking about the idea of plots of land that have been unused for time, and this place has been an allotment site in the past. Organically had got Pocket Parks funding to take it on and to transform it into a community food growing space. There is an issue there, which is that there isn't a water source, a long history around that, but they, as we're working in collaboration with them, they invited us to come and see it and asked if we would like to take it on to grow our herbs, as they're perennial, so kind of less water intensive. And it's this amazing, beautiful site on the hillside looking over the reservoirs. So we did take it on this time last year and started to clear it. It was overgrown for decades, so a lot of blackthorn and bramble. So our little crew, obviously it was the time of the beginning of the lockdown, so it was just our little team starting to clear it. And through the spring and summer and autumn, as we were able to invite volunteers back, we had greater numbers and started to clear the site. We're currently preparing it to start planting herbs, and we also planted a small medicinal forest garden in one part of the site, because the really exciting thing about this site is the size of it. So there is a good deal of space for quite substantial herb growing. And the idea, the vision of the project is to support people to come together to exchange knowledge around food and medicine growing through the practice of it from seed to salve. So learning how to start cultivating, propagating medicinal plants, how to take care of them, and then how to make them into medicines together. So the idea is the kind of elements that Sarah described earlier, the health, the activity, the togetherness and the rootedness in place. So with this site, we've really experienced this through the volunteers starting to come through the last half of 2020, through the summer and autumn, really forming an amazing crew of people that were coming and accessing, being able to access the land, being able to learn skills together. And a big part of it has been engaging with the neighbours who live around the site, because obviously that is the land that they're connected with, and they also have plots on the side of it. And Mariella will speak a little bit now, I think, about the plans with it, but it's going to be a combination of our herb gardening and allotment site, so a lot of potential there for people to connect and to share skills with each other. So yeah, it's been a really exciting project so far. I'm really looking forward to, we're having volunteers coming back from next week, and there's a sense of a real community starting to develop around it just now. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Rasika, and Dee, and Sarah, and Fee for inviting us. I'm Mariela Diaz. I work for Wolf and Forest Council. You have seen Rasika and the marvelous jobs the team they are doing in Mulberry Close. Basically, we took the work we do in stages. So we have a one-to-one small scale collaboration with a partner. In Mulberry Close, for example, it was Rasika and the team, Organically team. And it's a combination of allotments and use allotment land and different organizations. And this is, I would like to highlight the importance of this partnership because it brings to the table people that they are normally excluded from growing. For example, in Mulberry Close, Rasika is contacting residents and people who are not able to keep an allotment garden. And well, if COVID allows it, we will have soon open days for residents and local residents to come to learn how to cultivate and how to learn about medicinal garden. That in a small scale. Then, as Sarah said, we are busy creating our food growing strategy. So this brings it a little bit more up to another level. So we got the combination of allotments and charities or schools, and then the food growing strategy is going to involve is going to go beyond allotments. It's going to involve all the community food growing sites across the borough as well. So far, we have identified 65 community food growing areas within the borough. We are looking forward to create a network, a food growers network with everyone. We have completed the consultation period, so we have contacted residents to see what they want to see, you know, what they want to see, what they want to grow, why they want to grow. It was really interesting to see the results of our survey. 72% of people said that they want to grow because it's fun. Because they enjoy it, because I think that's important as well. You know, when obviously it's important to tackle food poverty, but the happiness, the joyful, you know, the joy of cultivating your own food is really important. And then the third stage is going to be a food partnership between a combination of our, you know, food growing strategy, our food poverty strategy, and our climate emergency strategy. So basically, we have supported organically to apply for extra funding for the Food Roots Incubator Program. So this food partnership is going to mainly tackle food poverty and through food growing as well. So we will have a Wolf and Forest Food Partnership Coordinator, and the coordinator is basically going to develop 2 networks. So it's going to be a community food distribution network and a community growers network. And so that's so far as much as we have done. If you have any questions, so please let me know.
Wow, that's really brilliant. All the things us as sort of community food growers have been campaigning for many years. And you know, it's that bringing together of sort of the food partnership with food poverty and climate emergency to, you know, develop something that is truly meaningful for local residents. We have another case study from Glasgow, and we have Abby Morden from Glasgow Community Food Network, Propagate and Hidden Veg. And Abby is a founder member of Propagate and a seasoned food activist. She has been working across community and local food projects for over 20 years and is passionate about food sovereignty and resilience. As an experienced grower, facilitator, practitioner, and researcher, Abby's inclusive and collaborative attitude encourages everyone to be involved in thinking about and creating sustainable food systems. Abby is also the chair and co-founder of the Glasgow Community Food Network, co-founder of Glasgow Food Policy Partnership, and holds an MSc in food security.
Thank you, Dee. What an introduction. Thanks so much. Great. It's so nice to be here today and to be hearing all these other case studies. I've had a big, massive grin on my face hearing about all the other work that's happening around the country and thinking about sort of comparable things that we've got going on. But yeah, I've been asked to give a sort of 7 or 8 minutes on what's happening in Scotland and particularly in Glasgow. So a bit of an overview of how the food growing strategies enable and support community growing in Scotland in different ways. So a little bit of background first. The Community Empowerment Act came into force in Scotland in 2015. It has a whole range of different measures from sort of community ownership and community buyout kind of clauses. Part 9 focused in on allotments and community growing. It was approved in 2018. And at that point, local authorities are given 2 years roughly to create and publish their food growing strategies. So they were meant to have that ready to go by April 2020. This was kind of the result of the allotment lobby, which is very strong in Scotland, and also a group called the Grow Your Own Working Group, which was facilitated and enabled by Social Farms and Gardens, which, as you probably all know, is previously known as Federation of City Farms and Community Gardens. And that group has been sort of sitting within as a sort of advisory group to the Scottish Government for quite a long time, really kind of lobbying hard to sort of level the playing field, I suppose, around community growing. So local authorities had various different approaches to creating their food growing strategies. And I'm going to give sort of a couple of different examples before I focus in on Glasgow. So I think the pre-existing conditions and the movements around Grow Your Own within different local authorities in different areas really sort of created different approaches. So for example, in Glasgow and Dundee, where there have been thriving networks of community gardens for a really long time. You know, we've been sort of growing the local food movement in Glasgow, particularly since about 2009, and networking together since that point, and kind of, you know, hassling the city council to sort of give it, you know, and increase and improve access to land. And that's kind of, it's had its effects. I can't remember in what years the Glasgow City Council introduced stalled spaces funding, but stalled spaces was a kind of reaction to community groups asking for access to land and support as well. So there were small grants became available for £2,500 for community organisations, community groups to access vacant and derelict land for a temporary amount of time, hence the term stalled spaces. And they could do different types of activities there, from sort of arts to growing to events and all sorts of other things. That scheme still exists. Meanwhile, in places like Edinburgh and also Dumfries and Galloway, where there was not so much of a kind of coherent food movement, the local authorities struggled to engage meaningfully, and the food growing strategies didn't really have the same amount of traction. So I relocated to Dumfries and Galloway roughly a year ago, and one of the first things I did was dig around to find the food growing strategy, because it's obviously coming from Glasgow. That was very exciting. It was passed at committee in 2018, so the same year that they were asked to sort of start thinking about producing it. Passed at committee, somewhere buried within the local authorities' sort of committee papers, pretty hard to find. A whole action plan attached to it, with clearly no actions actually having been implemented up to that point, and that was, as I say, April last year. So meanwhile, back in Glasgow, we worked really closely with a dedicated staff resourced team, 3 people within the local authority who were tasked with co-creating the food growing strategy. And obviously they looked to us as the food growing network, and also the allotments community within the city to help inform and co-create the food growing strategy. We also had support from Green Space Scotland, who were funded through the Scottish Government to help 4 different local authorities, I think, to sort of carry out some really thorough community engagement. So the local authority held 23 local consultation events across the city, so that's 1 for every ward, which were really well attended and had sort of bits and sort of folk from different projects speaking about their work. Attendees at those events were asked to nominate sites in their area where they thought could be a community growing space. The council then took those kind of nominated sites away. They kind of went through them to find out, firstly, whether the ownership, so did the local authority own it, and if not, who did it have any other development potential earmarked for it, so was it therefore possible to be grown on, and any other kind of contamination sort of reports that might be applicable that have already happened and already applied to that site. There is going to be a map produced. It's not online yet, as far as I know. And if Sandy Patterson's sitting in the audience somewhere, he can contradict me. He is our go-to food growing officer in the council. But as far as I know, it's not online yet. mostly because that 3-person team was whittled down to 1 when Ken retired and Ruth went off on maternity leave. It's really nice knowing your food growing team in the local authority by name and being able to hug them after when you see them at meetings. Not that we've done that for the last year. So yeah, collaborative approach, and what's happening now is the team in Glasgow have kind of created a working group, a steering group, which is made up of community growing and allotments activists across the city. So that steering group is in place to help guide and oversee the implementation of the food growing strategy. And additionally, there is funding and support being made available. So there'll be micro grants for new projects. They're just working out the criteria for that at the moment, as I understand it, to enable more food growing projects to happen. And all of that is sitting within a context of kind of other food work happening in the city. So if you look at the Glasgow City Food Plan, that's as part of the Sustainable Food Places work that we do in the city. We've just co-created this the City Food Plan, which is a sustainable and healthy and equitable food plan, and the food growing strategy will sit within that, and also within another strategy in the council called the Open Space Strategy, and that looks at all open spaces across the whole of Glasgow, both in terms of parks, vacant derelict land, and thinking about, okay, how can we use these spaces in a more inclusive and healthy and sustainable way. So yeah, lots of really exciting stuff happening in Glasgow. And as I say, I think the implementation and the creation of the food growing strategies really varies from local authority to local authority, very much depending on the enthusiasm and the strength of the movement that's kind of, you know, coming from the grassroots up. So there's got to be a strong and coherent movement and a strong coherent local food voice that can speak on behalf of that sector and talk to your colleagues in the council, in fact, until they become your friends. That would be my approach. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Abby. So quite a lot there as well, in terms of land and land access and ownership and planning and development, and security of tenure. So whether it's a meanwhile space or stalled space, that's a new phrase for me, or longer term sort of agreements. So we're going to take a few questions. We can't answer everything. We'll endeavor to answer as much as we can. And then we'll go into another poll. So if the speakers could come back on so that we can see you all. So the first question is from Jenny Wilson. And she's asking who or what team within council will have the information on unused green spaces that could be used for community growing schemes. And that goes out to anyone.
Well, in Waltham Forest, it will be allotments, parks and open spaces, but that depends of each council.
I was going to say, and therein lies the question, because I think the difficulty is that often local authorities won't have a comprehensive idea of all of their land assets, particularly the ones that you might lean into for community growing, which are the sort of incidental spaces that operate around. So I've heard lots of stories. In fact, I think Organically actually started by cycling around the area and looking for some large bits of land and then finding out who owned that land. So I think, unfortunately, at the moment, it often happens that way round. I would say some local authorities are trying to map land and look at their land assets, and to do that. And for those of you that are working with or from local authorities, that is a really good place to start. There are property assets, but they are only often looking at it from a financial point of view. The one thing I would say is, if your local authority has a halt nursery, particularly a disused one, find out about it and find out what they're doing about it, because they're absolutely amazing assets. If you can get your hands on one of them, you're winning.
Okay. Another question from Barbara. Do London councils have allotments as well as community gardens? And are the rules for allotments different to the ones for community gardens? And I think that one's for you, Sarah, or Fee.
I mean, yes, London does have community allotments as well as community gardens. The waiting lists are huge, and are increasing and have been increasing throughout the last year. Specific rules, Sarah, you might want to come in on that. I mean, it will differ a bit between each borough.
Yeah. I mean, it also depends on if it's a statutory allotment, or if it's a private allotment, or if it's the term allotment gets thrown around a lot, but actually, if it's a statutory allotment, it's protected by quite specific laws, and there are specific rules on what you can and can't do on that. And Mariella, you're probably the expert on this, so do you want to say a bit more? But yeah, I'd say where it is a statutory allotment, there's definitely separate rules.
Well, there is, I think, a mistake of treating sometimes community food growing sites as mini allotments. You know, it shouldn't be like that at all, in my opinion. As you said, allotments is very specific. It's the Allotment Act of 1925, and previous that, different acts passed by different governments. You are right, there are two different type of allotments. The statutory one is protected by law. So basically you need the secretary. If you want to change anything within the allotment boundaries, you need the permission of the Secretary of State, which is very fancy. And then the temporary ones, well, that depends, because if they can prove that they've been there over 25 years, you know, they start to have certain protection, depends of each council as well. So I don't really, we don't really make that difference in Waltham Forest. Obviously, we do have both kinds, but we treat all the allotments as we protect all the land the same. And then the community food growings, yes, they do have different rules, because, you know, it's not the same, the community food growing site that La Classica has got in Mulberry, welcoming new residents. They don't have specific rules. Only agreements with the people attending the community food growing sites. But allotments, they do have a specific set of rules, and each council has got an allotment tenancy agreement with the rules. So yes, it's a very different, in my opinion, it's a very different concept.
Okay. And a question for Rashika. How exactly did Hedge Herbs and Waltham Forest Council get in touch to start the working collaboration? And basically, Maya's interested to know how approachable or accessible councils are for setting up food growing spaces. So let's start with you, Rashika, and maybe Mariella, you would like to come in, and anyone else after. Yeah.
I was saying Mariella is very accessible and approachable, as you can see, but we've been really blessed in that the community apothecary has been working alongside Organic Lee. So Organic Lee have been the connecting factor there, because they already had a relationship with the council, and you had been in discussion with you, Mariella, I think, about this space in Chingford at Mulberry Close for a while. So that was, yeah, that was the connection there, I would say. I'm just looking at the question again. But you had always been very supportive of our project, in the sense that it's not predominantly food growing, although there will be an element of that. But you have been, Mariela, very supportive of the idea of growing the medicinal herbs and training people, developing skills in that as well.
Well, from my point of view, from the allotments, from the council and the allotments officer point of view, I wanted to bring to the traditional allotment growing alternatives and different point of views, and that's why I'm working with Rasika with the medicinal garden, but I also inviting schools because basically is to bring to the traditional, nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong with the traditional allotment here and plot hold, you know, and the plot, but I wanted to bring to the table people that they are normally excluded. Like if you bring to have an allotment in Waltham Forest, you have to be over 18 and you have to be a Waltham Forest resident. So children are excluded because I'm not going to rent a plot to someone underage. So, but if you give a plot to a school, it brings children to the allotment site. For example, I also work with, we are starting to work now with a group called Diverse, and they work with young adults that live with learning and physical disabilities. So some of these young adults will not be able to have an allotment on their own, but if the charity rents a plot with us, they can bring the group to the allotments. We are working with people that they don't have permanent residences or addresses. Like we work with a charity, Soil Sisters, and they work with women that they suffer domestic violence. So obviously that sometimes they're in a refuge house, and obviously you cannot you cannot disclose the address of that, you know. So basically from Waltham Forest Council, we are looking for people that they want alternative ways of growing, and that's for the allotment sites, but also we are looking for that type of groups for the community food growing.
Okay, how are we doing for time? Yeah.
Fee, well, how much time have we got? Do you know?
We've got time for another question, Dee.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, moving between chat and let's go for the Scottish one. So Peter Sampson is interested in the contrast between Glasgow and Dumfries and Galloway, and what should D&G have done to encourage more of a local community movement?
I think this is applicable to anywhere, really, not just D&G, and it's about growing a local food movement, and it's really hard because I know that the Health and Social Care Partnership in Dumfries and Galloway did try to be that kind of to be that sort of face of the public engagement, and did try to sort of convene a local growing network in Dumfries and Galloway. The problem is that was always going to be top down. It's got to come from the groups and organisations themselves, and local authorities and the NHS can help, and housing associations can help by offering capacity and resources, but it has to be done by and for the community growing projects and community food projects, and not to them. So it is really hard to sort of, someone's got to start that ball rolling, and then have the resources and the time and the capacity and the skills to sort of contact all the other community growing projects they know of and get them on board. And I don't know if you ever looked at a map of Scotland, but Dumfries and Galloway is bloody massive. It's a huge geographic area with a smaller population than Glasgow, but absolutely enormous. So the coherence between one end of the region and the other, it takes 2 hours to drive, which is arguably how long it takes to drive across London, right enough. But yeah, it's got to come from the grassroots up. You can't force it. And of course, when the NHS ran out of money and resources to sort of support that community growing network, it just fell to pieces, because nobody has sort of been given the skills and the capacity to carry on running it themselves. So I'm hopeful that we can see some change around that. I'm doing some work around that now to sort of help make that happen. But like I say, it's got to come from the grassroots up. So movements and networks, that's the only way. Thanks.
Okay. Fee, I think we have another poll, is it, right now?
Yeah, I think Ren's just putting it up now. Can everybody see that?
Great, just a couple more people to fill it in, but I will stop the poll very soon.
Could you share the results as well, please? So very interesting. So your council has made a start, but could be doing more.
Gee, you're on mute.
Ah, yes. The old Zoom thing when you think you're unmuted. Let's go to our second part. And it is about looking at sort of public land and council assets to support larger scale growing. And Sustain has started a project with other organizations around fringe farming. And we have Rob Logan, who is the peri-urban farming officer from Sustain. And his work looks at increasing access to land for agroecological farming at the edge of UK cities. Rob has been a community food grower, educator and organizer based in London for over 10 years and is focused on the co-generation of food systems connected by social justice, ecology, and people's knowledge. Over to you, Rob.
Hi everyone, afternoon. I'm just going to share a presentation with you. And we'll start from here. Is that good, Dee? Can you see that? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the potential of peri-urban farming and how councils can support this activity. So I thought I'd start with where is the peri-urban? A recent report described it as anywhere on the edge of the city with about 10 kilometres beyond the urban into rural areas. You can see a view into Glasgow, highlighting the peri-urban area there. And then I just thought I'd briefly kind of outline why peri-urban. Well, I think, you know, in the last year, we've especially seen through COVID threats to an import-heavy food supply, where we've actually seen a lot of community food organisations coming in and stepping in and filling the gaps of a food system that's really over-reliant on supermarkets. Whilst at the same time, we've seen massive increases in demand for veg pot schemes with waiting lists of up to 7,000 people being reported in some cases. And then at the same time with post-Brexit, and in terms of rewriting agriculture policy, it's an opportunity to really build regional ecological food systems that are really much more resilient to external threats. Secondly, historically, we can see that as cities develop, there was always often food growing around the city walls, especially perishable goods close to market. And in the UK, about 50 years ago, you'd often see market gardens that ringed cities. But as supermarket power has increased, a lot of these enterprises shut down, unfortunately. But what we have now in this situation is that because of the working of the land, historically, we have very fertile soils close to cities in the peri-urban. The last thing I wanted to point out was what we can learn from ecological design and something called edge effects. So between two or more habitats, say the field and the forest, or the ocean and the beach, you have these transition zones that are very productive, creative, and there's a lot of resource sharing between them. These are the edge effects. So in thinking about planning, urban planning, and food systems, we can see that the peri-urban as an edge effect is a very productive and dynamic space to grow food. I'll just move on to the next slide. The farming that we're talking about as in our work this year is agroecology, and it's particularly suited to fringe farming because not only is it productive, it also helps to retain the ecological benefits of rural and peri-urban spaces. To jargon bust a little bit, agroecology fuses ecological and social principles to producing food through regenerative practices. So an ecological principle might be working with natural cycles, and a social principle might be that all workers deserve decent and fair livelihoods, and food systems are best created through communities and kind of responding to farmers' knowledges. So if we think about agroecology in the peri-urban, and this idea of the edge effect, the history of fertile soils and kind of resilient food systems, we can see that fringe farming can build connections between the urban and rural, and with agroecology have multiple benefits that I think have been outlined previously, but just to reiterate, these are economic with jobs, services and products in regional economies. Agroecology farms often have community development and education programs. And then finally, environmental, whether this is increasing biodiversity or carbon sequestration through ecological soil management. Being excited about these, the potential of fringe farming, Sustain and Shared Assets started work in London last year and did a briefing where they found that if around 1% of the land in the peri-urban was converted from cereals and grassland to vegetables, then there could be an increase of about 1 million kilograms of fruit and veg into London's food supply. So this is kind of the opportunity that we have. The multiple benefits connect with existing goals and targets for local and regional governance, whether this is climate change action plans working towards a zero carbon city, or for example, the Bristol One City approach. You know, fringe farming can support education and economic targets. So how do we do? What do we do next together? Well, I, as a farmer myself that worked on the peri-urban project, and within networks in cities, you often hear about access to land. And so we've had farm start programs in London and Manchester, education programs around farming in Glasgow and all over the country. So we have a new generation of growers. And at the same time, we have this massive increase in demand for regional, culturally appropriate, ecological food. So how do we connect the two demands? How do we connect the dots? This is where the opportunity lies. And so this year, Sustain is working with partners that you can see on the right-hand side. You just heard Abby speak earlier from the Glasgow Community Food Network. And we want to focus on this issue of access to land. We want to understand the barriers. We want to identify local land opportunities and local actions that councils can take, whilst also feeding into developing national policy, especially at this post-Brexit moment. And so this year, we're particularly focusing on doing research and action planning in Bristol, Glasgow and Sheffield, and then building on the pilot work in London from last year. And at the same time, we're working with the Land Workers Alliance to set up a practitioner forum, which really will help to identify key issues to support policy development. So it's early doors. The project really began in January, and we've just had our first practitioner forum last week, and our first event to build an action plan in Bristol will be next month. So these are some early recommendations that I'll just quickly outline for council actions. So the first one has already been mentioned, but just to develop food strategies, policies and action plans that really includes the production and the distribution of agroecological foods, and that these policies are taken forward into council's local plans. Secondly, Sarah mentioned this already, but we've heard a lot from growers that there is land that the council owns, but they don't really know where it is and how they access it. So really mapping land and other assets in a way that's publicly available. And we had that, you know, what would it mean for there to be a list of possible opportunities that were transparent, that people could apply for, so that there were equitable opportunities for setting up enterprises in the peri-urban. Thirdly, to really actively identify land at the edge of cities in council's local plans, to actively do this, but really kind of enabling long-term market gardening sites. Fourthly, fourthly, in terms of setting up community enterprise, we can really connect the dots again. So in producing foods that have climate and nature benefits, if these were going into schools, for example, not only would you benefit in terms of climate change targets, but you could also support enterprises in building viable businesses. Finally, something that came up in our Bristol research so far has been how a regional food hub in an area can be a kind of distribution point for the production and distribution of agroecological foods, and also you could build in potential education and training opportunities into those kind of hubs, really. So that's it. If you have any more questions, or you want to get in touch to hear more about our fringe farming work this year, just please get in contact, and I'll share some of the references in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That was really comprehensive, and really love the list at the end of sort of actions local authorities can make. I think one of the things for me that was missing was doing that in partnership with sort of farmers and communities and local organizations, so that they become truly meaningful and not top down. And I also like that thing of looking back to, you know, go forward. So learning from our history about our market gardens and bringing those into now and into the future. So next we have Emma Eves Anderson from the London Borough of Greenwich and GCDA. And Emma is going to debunk some common council myths. Emma is the Obesity Public Health Officer at the Royal Borough of Greenwich. She has a remit that focuses on improving food education in primary schools through the Food for Life Award, supporting organizations to make small, sustainable changes to their food and drinks offer as part of Sugar Smart, and most recently has started investigating community gardening and growing opportunities for residents in the borough. All yours, Emma.
Thank you, Dee. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. Oh. Can everyone see that? Fabulous. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, so I'm just, as Dee said, I am Emma Eves Anderson. I'm the obesity officer at Royal Borough of Greenwich, and over the last few months I've been looking at how we can potentially increase community, our community growing offer within the borough. So I'm just going to take you through what I think are 3 barriers that I have encountered and that other people may have encountered and how to potentially counteract them on a quest to increase growing. So the first is the thought that growing is a nice to have rather than a good to have. And I would say that, being cynical, that we could argue that that's true for many initiatives that run in the council, outside of keeping schools open, keeping roofs over residents' heads and looking after vulnerable people. But obviously, as we know, our lives are not limited to those necessities in any way, and that we need so much more to assist us in living well-rounded, content lives. So I think first the need to kind of like nudge people out of that mindset is important. And then when it comes to growing, we know that there is a big supportive evidence base that councils really like, that highlight the positive impact of gardening and growing activities on physical and mental well-being outcomes for residents, for families. So for us within public health, for example, growing has very much the potential to carry the same weight and importance as any other healthy living initiative would do in our borough. So having that knowledge base is, I think, really powerful. Secondly, when we're thinking about growing as being thought of as a nice to have, is to find out whether or not that's actually what departments think. So that goes back to kind of like wherever you're coming from, whether you're like in-house within the local authority or are part of a different organisation or institutional group, is just to start talking to people and find out exactly if that's what the thought process, and also to read action plans. Like, it's been mentioned a lot, but like in the council, we can't really act on anything until we've got something to kind of like push us forward with an action plan or an ambition. So take that and then investigate what the council is already doing to determine if growing can have a place there. So it has been mentioned a couple of times, but it's also something that we're looking at in Greenwich, is working with the housing department, who obviously they operate as a landlord and very kind of quite potentially have quite a lot of space to offer for use for a gardening or growing activity, and kind of using them as an example. So within our housing department, their priorities within their action plan are currently to empower residents and to improve the look and feel of estates. So both these two ambitions can be kind of tailored to food growing and gardening, and then also it puts that department in a position where they are kind of ready, willing and able to take forward a project like this. And then obviously if that fails, it could be looking around to other areas, so talking to schools and community centres or within primary care and finding out if there's any work that can be done there. So again, for us in Greenwich, we work quite closely with schools, so that's an avenue. Our community centres are council run, and they have certain corporate like social responsibility requirements, and obviously a lot of interest and people ready on hand to help. And then also for us with primary care, we have like a social prescribing model, so it's looking as can we get social prescribing to feature growing, for example, and things like that within primary care. And then kind of like the other thing with this is the fact that I think that time plays an important role kind of in this misconception. And by that is, I think it's like the timing related to a combination of available money and the interests and priorities of directorates and departments, and obviously how that fits in with when councils are approached. And I think it's also relevant to where kind of we find ourselves at the minute in Greenwich. So we feel like within public health that we're coming to a point where there is a new appreciation of the value of growing from a central position. And some of this comes from the fact that in first lockdown, the council leader just acknowledged the fact that being outside was going to be really important, and also the value that comes from people growing their own and things like that. And it was kind of that sort of like soundbite that provided us with a bit of ammunition to start thinking about expanding this area of work. And obviously, like, there are other reasons, but that's kind of like one of the triggers that sticks with me. The second is that kind of growing can be sort of like cost cutting, and that means that ambitions for it gets sort of like lost and diluted. Thing I would say around this is that obviously for us as a local authority, we spend so much of our time like working in silo, working on our own in our own directorates and departments. And really the greatest strength that we should have is the fact that well, up until last year, we were all working in one building. And so we should all be in partnership together. And something that the local authority really should be good at is that it can work to bring more people around the table, increase that feelings of ownership and commitment across departments, and then also draw on expertise in different areas to bring about positive results. So I really think that this shouldn't be something that hinders work, and instead it should try and ground it and like give it prominence. And so in Greenwich at the minute, the carbon neutral plan is being prepared, and so that's quite a good example of how quite a high level cross-cutting document can be used to gather support and ask for commitment from key people, be allocated with adequate resources, and kind of have very clear stated and agreed aims to try and like integrate growing opportunities on a wider scale in the borough over time. Obviously, that is to say that food growing opportunities are part of like one of the themes within that. And that's a similar thing can be said for us in Greenwich with their Healthy Weight Task Force. And so this obviously is public health led, but it is it's a senior level group that has like cabinet leadership and things like that. And within that, they've made a commitment to identify across departments and across agencies different opportunities to address healthy weight in the borough. And so if you can get something in there, then the councillors never shut up about it, and that's great, and that's what you need. So that's that. And then finally, the third thing is that growing is too specialist and therefore scary. And I think this is something that I have definitely thought when I started working in this area last summer. I often start meetings with the caveat, I do not grow. I do have a plant next to me, but you can't see it, but it doesn't help. But to say that if you're sitting here this afternoon kind of from a local authority, and you don't have any expertise, and it's something that really shouldn't put you off. So obviously I think growing, more than a lot of programs that can be run by local authority, it represents the perfect opportunity to call on the local community groups and networks for expertise and advice, because obviously it's going to be set up for something that the community to benefit from. But obviously you will find, I think it was Abby who mentioned, no, Mariella who mentioned she found 65 groups in a mapping exercise in Waltham Forest, and it's probably a similar thing in Greenwich. So we know that there are horticultural groups, allotments, social enterprises, networks, and also even network expert officers kind of like within the borough itself, and these can all be utilised to help kind of drive work forward and provide assistance. And yeah, and if you're not an expert, then it doesn't matter, because your expertise comes in different ways through project managing, being able to create networks and kind of really kind of creating an agenda for change. And yeah, that's me all done. Thanks.
Right on time. Right, so we're going into another Q&A session, and we're going to do this very quickly. So one for you, Emma, could you say a bit more about what you're doing with schools?
Yeah, so for us within public health, so we run the Food for Life Award for schools. So that's a food education and change award scheme from the Soil Association. And so with that carries a number of requirements for schools to set up and establish growing areas within schools. And so we provide support for schools to be able to achieve that. We work really closely with the Greenwich Cooperative Development Agency, GCDA, who employ a couple of community gardeners, one of who I work with to provide training to schools to take them through everything they need to know to how to set up and run a space, and then also how to relate it to the curriculum as well. So it's really important. One of the reasons that we like Food for Life so much in the borough is that any kind of food growing or cookery skills work or kind of like visits to the city farm is they're not offered as like an additional extra or something that are a nice to have, as we said before. It's very much integrated into a school's curriculum. So a class may undertake a gardening project across 1 or 2 terms. A class may, for example, count seeds for planting in a maths lesson, like in foundation stage. A class may like conduct science experiments, being in the garden space and things like that. And so that's the key, is getting everyone involved in the garden for us.
Okay. So a question from Claudia: how can one council learn best practice with community and school food growing from another in a national and or international context? And that goes out to anyone who wants to have a go at it.
Create best practice. I don't know, I'd say you guys in Sustain are quite good at highlighting good practice. I think like obviously for us in Greenwich, I feel like we are in quite a fortunate position in that we do have GCGA, and we operate quite a lot of programs under the Good Food in Greenwich banner, which is the ambition for the borough to be known as a good place for good food by everyone. And so that obviously creates quite a nice beacon, but it's taken, I mean, I've only been with the borough for 4 years, but it's taken 30 years for the borough to get to that point. And simple things like the logo will still get missed off like publications sometimes and things like that, but it's constant. And I know like a lot of people have been talking about having like kind of like food growing action plans and things like that. We don't even have one of those in the borough. We've only just recently started a food growing network. That's like a new thing for us, and the borough itself, we're held up as like doing really good work, but there's still so much more that we can do as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that my experience of working in London is a lot of places and a lot of communities in London are particularly empowered to go for it. There's a lot of energy and a lot of activity, and so therefore I think as well as good practice, you know, people bounce off each other. I think in some other areas where maybe there's less going on outside of London, there's a real need for people to sort of join in and sign up to these networks, and to really look to neighbouring authorities or for those ideas and inspirations. So yeah, we're always along with many other organisations like us, like Social Farms and Gardens and some of the incredible edible networks that are out there and doing brilliant stuff. So we're not doing it on our own. We're particularly expertise in signposting, and we're particularly interested in what roles councils can play in shaping and supporting a lot of that grassroots activity. So yeah, we're happy to signpost. I think it might have slipped down the chat, and I'm sure it will get a plug at the end, but we have our Good to Grow event happening over this weekend, and you know, usually that would be an invite to go and visit gardens and to see what's going on in them, but we'd encourage you to look online instead and to see what's going on in your local area or further afield. And we often do those sort of networking events. There's nothing like visiting a garden to get it, and also to get your politicians to get it as well. So I would just plug that as an approach. But I think that yeah, we have, once you're in the networks, you know where they are. I suppose part of the challenge for us is reaching out to the people that might not know about these networks. So if you are one of the gardens that or councils at the beginning that said they aren't involved in capital growth or Good to Grow, then do look us up and see how we can support and help you.
And I think one last question, and this goes out to Waltham Forest. How will the Food Partnership Coordinator plan on linking the food distribution network with the food growing network? And will there be any collaboration around food waste?
Well, we just got the grant a couple of weeks ago, and I don't think the food coordinator has been hired. The food partnership coordinator has been hired yet, so I don't fully have the answer for that. But we do have. We do have I do have an example of in a smaller scale, we have been contacting food banks, and one of our allotment sites, they got we have given funding to one of our allotment sites to do a composting area. So any food that is not is not suitable to be distributed in the food bank goes to the allotment site and is composted, and then is used in the allotment gardens. But obviously this is going to be a much bigger scale, so I'm not sure. I'm afraid I haven't got that information yet.
Okay. And someone is plugging for a question to be answered, and that is, why are there more women involved in food growing?
I mean,
and that goes out to everyone.
I mean, I wonder, Dee, do you have a theory on this? So I've got a theory. You want to hear my theory?
Yeah.
My theory is that largely, I mean, probably slightly in part directed by Dr. Elaine Swan, who's done some really interesting research on gender and food issues, and perhaps we should do a webinar on it. But it's largely unpaid work, I would say. It's heavily volunteer-based, food provision, community growing, and so it's just my theory is that largely that is unpaid, and often that ends up being the domain of a lot of women. Women do a lot of unpaid cooking, unpaid childcare, and I think it spills over into this world. So I haven't got an answer, and I don't know if that is the answer, but I just I wonder if that's what it's about.
Well, actually, I come from allotments, and it used to be quite the opposite. Allotments used to be the ground of middle-aged men, and in some of the traditional ones, it still is. Usually when I go to meetings, it's 50-50, pretty much proportionate. Food growing is new to me. Like Emma, in Wolfen Forest, we are starting to everything, as I said, everything is at the very, very beginning. I don't know. I cannot think of any specific reason apart. We are just there, we are interested, and we are ready. Probably women are more prompt to action, I think.
Abby, I know you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Maria there more than Sarah, maybe, but a combination of the two. I know that speaking from a sort of community food worker perspective, all the workers tend to be women, largely speaking anyway, but the volunteers that are referred through GPs or wherever else are often blokes, kind of older guys in their 50s, that kind of thing. And people that come voluntarily because they want to get involved in gardening tend to be women. So maybe it's an aspect of caring more. Sounds terrible. Sorry, Rob. Present company accepted. But I don't know. Yeah, it's just more likely to put ourselves forward to kind of perhaps work voluntarily to change the world, and not sort of be focused on getting paid for it or something like that. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really got a theory, but it is an observation that I've also made over the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, maybe this is a discussion for another webinar.
Yeah. We've talked before about unionising community food growers. I know Susanna's in on the chat, and we've long had an ambition to look at that. But yeah, for future topics, let us know what you think.
Yeah. So we've come to the end. There's a lot of resources, links, food for thought for local authorities to think about, as well as actions that could be taken. And, you know, as well as sort of developing sort of policy and integrating sort of food policy, I think, you know, this is a challenge to all our local authorities to truly work with local communities in moving forward, in thinking about where we get our food from, and in supporting not only our growers and farmers, but supporting local communities in terms of their better health, in terms of resilience, in terms of jobs and education, health and well-being. And I would say we need to think beyond community food growing. We need to think about farming as well, and not just horticulture. You know, for me, that's the next step. Why aren't we keeping chickens? Why don't we have small scale dairies? There's a lot more we can be doing in terms of supporting strong food systems in our cities and in other parts of the country. So I'd like to thank our amazing speakers for all their wisdom and, you know, commitment to this work. And I look forward to joining everyone again on another one of these webinars. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dee. Thanks for hosting, everyone. I believe we'll send around some follow-up info. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you, Mariella. Thanks for doing such a great job in my borough.
Well, it's not me, it's people like Rasika, like Organic.
Yeah, of course.
You know, we are so fortunate to have